Hello guys, this is another video I'm making, one of my thoughts videos. Um, one of my thoughts that I want to talk about today that I'm having is, of course, the idea of the Pentagon having a lot of influence, particularly in the filming of a lot of superhero films. One of the reasons why I brought this up was um, me and my partner, well, my girlfriend, we had a conversation because we rewatched last night we rewatched Man of Steel, and it's very obvious that the Pentagon had a massive role in the funding of that film. And when you watch the movie, it's very clear that they cut some things out of the film that you would know that they would cut out because, of course, the Pentagon would cut it out. A great example is in the movie, particularly, you have Lois Lane, who is, well, we know is a journal. We know who Lois Lane is. But in the comics, she has a father, and her father is literally General Sam Lane. He's literally like, he's one of the more known recurring villains of Superman, of mythos in terms of lore. Um, he's, I mean, also, it would have actually explained Man of Steel better to why Lois Lane was able to have that much access walking around the U.S. military stuff going on because, her dad, it would have made actually sense. But one of the things that they removed from him is that General Sam Lane's actually a really bad person in the modern comics. He is known for being very pro, especially if you read Superman Unchained, there's a really good part about General Sam Lane and what he represents, especially how Scott Snyder wrote him. But in most version iterations of his comics, he's portrayed as a guy who really supports U.S. empire. He's totally down with, U.S. imperialism, everything happening in the U.S. In some versions of the comics, he actually is one of the ones who he sometimes has liaison with Amanda Waller, and he sometimes says like, "Yeah, we need to do Argos and whatever because the Justice League, U.S. government, we have no control over this team called Justice. We have no control over them at all." And there's a lot of things in the comics where Sam Lane attempts to kill Superman. In the modern Jeff Johns comics, you have Colonel John Corbin. So who eventually will become Metallo. They changed him. They turned him into Colonel John Corbin, right? Or Sergeant John Corbin, I believe. And these characters are not in at all in the building blocks for making Man of Steel, which is very bizarre to me. And one of the things that I always found, which made sense to me at first thinking about it, but it kind of shows you how complicit it is in the process of how the Pentagon does funding for these superhero movies, because that allows for certain characters to not be put in these films that are part of things. A great example of this is, of course, um, for some reason, when it comes to the Hulk, if you notice, they don't do a lot of movies with the Hulk because number one, what is the Hulk's biggest enemy? The United States government. Um, if you notice anything about the Hulk, the, the Hulk has a lot of messages in his stories that has to deal with the U.S. government being not a friendly thing, U.S. empire not being a good thing. So I think there's a reason why we haven't had so many modern Hulk films, especially with how monopolized the Pentagon has had influence over Hollywood movies, especially superhero films. We saw it with Captain Marvel, with I'm pretty sure other YouTubers have done videos on, the sort of Pentagon propaganda of, Captain Marvel. Um, we see this with, in some cases, even some of the Avengers movies, unfortunately. So, a lot of these movies get Pentagon funding, unfortunately. And, it's the same thing with, Winter Soldier, I believe, also got Pentagon funding. They had to, like, change, because originally, you can tell in the story, the U.S. government and Shield were the problem, and then they kind of did this whole weird thing with, oh, it was actually, Hydra, these secret Nazis that were actually controlling Shield, and it's like, okay, it's pretty bizarre messaging there, but you see it too. I mean, it's the same thing. I mean, instead, from what I heard with Man of Steel early production, they took out General Sam Lane. Though I think Zack Snyder took him out because, well, Man of Steel already had the Pentagon already funding the film, unfortunately. So, they knew they couldn't use Lois Lane's father, which would have been perfect to introduce him, but they couldn't use him because General Sam Lane in the comics is a genuine psychopath as a character. I mean, he literally is like U.S. Empire hoorah. Um, like if I were to describe him, he's basically like, well, he's basically a sociopathic Mad Dog Maddox if you think about it. But that's literally what he is, and and also they took out. Of course, they took out Colonel John Corbin. They took him out of the script, and that's the thing, and this is why I've always had issues when people always say like, oh, well, you can't really tell a good Superman story that is modern. It's not true. You can tell a good Superman story that is modern. The issue is, will the Pentagon let you? Um, will these other things actually let you do it? Unless you make it go out there and they're in fucking space or some shit. But if you do it, and that's always been a problem for me when it comes to a lot of superhero stuff because of the Pentagon's funding of some of these characters, who especially like Carol Danvers. Unfortunately, the one aspect is her Air Force thing, but it was really bizarre how the Air Force and all these other guys were pushing propaganda to basically be like, join the U.S. Air Force, join the U.S. Army, join this, and it's like, we're like superheroes, and it's like, okay, yet we're still doing global imperialism and things of that nature. Basically making people sign up to do that. I mean, that's basically what it is. So, and also this also had the reason after me and my girlfriend saw Man of Steel. This is why Zack Snyder portrayed Superman as a soldier, and I think Grant Morrison. I'll leave the video off on that. Grant Morrison had the best line comeback in that sense, in which he was at a talk gathering with people have saw on YouTube, and he says like, I don't like the fact that now superheroes are acting like soldiers now, like like they're no longer like unique in their own way, like they're now just kind of like soldiers. And he was referencing that to like Man of Steel. It's like, well, why did Superman kill Zod? Makes sense in the context of the story. Now it makes sense if you're portraying Superman to be like an unwitting, like if you have propaganda of Man of Steel, of the U.S. Army, everyone feels like Superman when we're in the U.S. government and the U.S. Army doing like imperial wars and everything. When you have propaganda like that being imposed in the movie you're watching, eventually, in many ways, of course, you're going to have a character in Superman who, in that film, is going to kill Zod and basically kind of portray him as a soldier. You know, um, even though Superman should, as a character, be more than that. Um, so I'll leave the video there at that. But there is a lot of influence in terms of the Pentagon, in terms of a lot of superhero stories. I didn't mention the one before I go. I forgot the one I forgot to mention, of course, and that is Iron Man. Iron Man is probably the biggest example of you want to talk about DoD funding. Um, Iron Man is probably like King Dingaling of that. So you know, there's nothing. I mean, the Pentagon is always going to have some influence in these kinds of superhero movies. And if you have a really good, clever director that's able to like have at least like some directors can get away with it. Like there are some directors that are able to like at least put an anti-imperialist message in the film, but it has to be like very out there. And like for example, like Thor Ragnarok has a very it has a very big theme about anti-imperialism, but it's so out there that it's kind of like removed from the audience. But you know, what would it be like if you had a story, a Superman story that dealt with the fact that, you know, the US government saw him as a threat to global US hegemony, Or, a story where, Superman is dealing with um, aspects of how journalism is nowadays, how there's a battle between doing actual truth telling, real journalism and access journalism, which is a lot of modern cable news and corporate media stuff today. I mean, there are certain great modern aspects. You can take Superman to so many great directions, especially with his character of Clark Kent in the case of like journalism, which I think is very relevant to bring up today, which I felt Grant Morrison was actually getting to before his series got canceled, New 52 series. And I think there's something really important in that. Um, and how, you know, you, you it's sort of like when I'm mentioning the Superman example, it sort of just shows you how the lack of potential in these superhero stories to tell very anti-imperialist narratives because of, you have the biggest global empire, US empire, that is funding a lot of the billing for these movies. So they really can't really have critiques of these things unless it's far out there. Unless it's in space and you make like you can't have one that's like particularly in a case that is there, or you're not going to get that much funding. Um, or something that really critiques the United States' role in things, you're not gonna get that much funding on a whole lot, unless it's like a historical drama on like something the U.S. did that was really bad. Like, you know, if we're doing a movie about the Civil War, of course they're gonna have this. We're gonna talk about. We already know if you have a movie on Civil War, there's no if buts about it. But if you have a modern day film that discusses these things, I mean, it's very difficult because the Pentagon is we're still having these sort of U.S. empire adventurism going on. And this is why I use the Superman example because people always talk about how do you do a modern Superman story, and I've always said it's not hard to do. It's not hard to do. You have to see his relationship with the press, which is very important because Clark Kent is a journalist. This idea of access journalism versus actually being telling the truth to people, and of course, what Superman represents to the global community in the sense that you have this alien with these powers, and the U.S. government sees him as a threat because it's kind of like a COINTELPRO thing. It's like, what happens when you have a character with that much magnitude of power like Superman, and he starts preaching something about, I don't know, maybe like his Golden Age counterpart? He starts talking about workers' rights and countries not being susceptible to U.S. imperialism. And what's incredible? There is literally a scene in one of the comics. I don't know if it was Superman Unchained, where General Sam Lane, when he's personally talking to one of his guys in the army, in the military brass, I think he's talking to a lieutenant general or something below him, and he literally says, "What happens when you got a Superman that doesn't represent our American values?" And I end the video right there because that right there just tells you why, like, how restrained superhero stories are to tell actual stories about the United States and what it represents in a critical way, and why they can at times, especially if these are more different types of heroes that, you know, where the Pentagon has more involvement in the funding of these films. And that's just one of my thoughts that I have. And you guys have a good day.